Chapter 6. Jake jerked out of his doze, tensing around the sleeping woman in his arms. Mac. Jesus Christ, I'm holding Mac. His ass and lower back were numb after hours of sitting on the cold, hard ground. But there wasn't a chance in hell he was moving. Not when the trusting, warm weight of Mackenzie reclined against his chest and her silky hair, freed from its bun, cascaded over the arms he had wrapped tightly around her. He welcomed, hell, he relished, the responsibility he felt for Mackenzie. Even when he dated other women, she was always somewhere in the back of his mind. Now the instinct to care for her, to protect her, had strengthened to a tangible level. He could feel his dedication to her in the thrumming beat of his heart. The sun wasn't yet visible, but the sky was lighter and birds were calling all around them. In the early morning calm, the events of yesterday had a hard edge of surrealness. But he'd watched enough end-of-the-world movies to know it was those who were prepared that survived. And while this may not be the end of the world, he wanted to fully kit the both of them in Essex. He was happy enough to get laughed at when they arrived back in Sanford, when this all sorted itself out. If it sorted itself out. The woman in the minivan with blood pouring out her nose flashed through his mind. Jake's stomach rumbled, reminding him of their meager food situation. It should be just over a mile to Essex, which he and Mackenzie could walk in half an hour. Wake up, sleeping beauty. She stirred, and then snuggled farther into him. He fought the urge to dismiss reality, to stay sitting here as long as he could with Mackenzie in his arms, because he knew that when they reached Sanford, he'd have to share her with Chloe, Kat, and Rachel. And those three were really shit at sharing. Jake couldn't remember a time in his life when the four girls hadn't been attached at the hip. They had a bond that made them more sisters than friends, and they were fierce in their love for each other. Absently, he lowered his head to sniff Mackenzie's hair for the 100th time, just as she sat up, her skull smacking into his face. Fuck, he groaned, throwing his head back and pinching the bridge of his nose with his fingers, pain spearing through him. Oh God, I'm so sorry. Mackenzie twisted in his lap to face him, her thighs straddling him. He groaned again, nose forgotten. He needed to get her off before she realized she was sitting on one hell of a boner. Before he could displace her, a gush of blood had him yanking up his shirt and holding it against his face. She moved closer, bringing her own hands to cover his. Are you okay? She asked softly, eyes wide. Just a bloody nose. I'll be fine, he mumbled, excruciatingly aware of the juncture of her thighs nestled over his throbbing cock. Jake knew the exact moment she comprehended his predicament. Those wide eyes blinked, and she audibly drew in a breath. Oh, okay. She stumbled to her feet and turned to face away from him, tugging the sleeves of her sweater down over her hands. Can you pass me the water that's in your backpack? He asked, getting to his feet slowly. This has already stopped bleeding. She passed it to him without meeting his eyes. Don't get weird on me. It's just an erection. Happens most mornings. He grinned. Nope, not going there. It's a normal bodily function. Jake, stop. We are not talking about your dick. You just did. She huffed and stalked toward the bushes she'd used last night. Laughing softly to himself, he rummaged through their food supplies and put together a passable breakfast of tomatoes, cheese, and a bread roll he split into two. Mackenzie came back, talking to herself. What's up? Yesterday's eyeliner can be today's smoky eye if you believe in yourself enough, she said. And if there's no mirror around to contradict you. He wasn't sure what to say to that. Don't say anything, she instructed. Babe, this conversation is above my friendship pay grade. And again with the babe. You don't like it? Instead of answering, she sat beside him and started eating. He grinned again. Jake and Mackenzie had been walking for just over 20 minutes, and even with the Band-Aids she'd reapplied, Mackenzie was struggling. Want a piggyback? He offered, only half joking. He'd carry this woman all the way to Sanford, not that she'd take him up on his suggestion. I'm fine, she answered primly, attempting to cover her limping. They reached a sign showing Essex was not far off, and a car passed them. Jake hitched out his thumb but was unsurprised when it didn't even slow down. The lack of people was unsettling. Had everyone locked themselves inside? Or was everyone dead? Jake shook his head resolutely. There's no way this thing had spread that quickly. And if this virus had wiped other countries out, they'd have heard on the news. Right? Ahead, he could see the fields giving way to industrial-looking buildings. I think if we cut through this field and head north, we'll end up near the center of town and bypass the outskirts, he said, shading his eyes. North, huh? Sometimes I wonder what happened to the people who asked me for directions. You what? Talking about north, south, east, and west is like a foreign language to me. I need you to say left and right, and then give me landmarks. Like I'll tell someone they need to follow the street until they pass the bakery, and then turn left at the boutique that has the yellow dress in the window. The way your brain works never ceases to amaze me. Just me, being as indispensable as always. There was something about the lilt in Mackenzie's voice that made him pause. You're one of the smartest people I know. You know that, right? Yeah, sure I am, she scoffed. It wasn't your dad paying your way through college or some miraculous inheritance that covered your education. You got 2 scholarships, Mac, and now you're a kick-ass environmental lawyer. She didn't respond, but from the tinge of pink to her high cheekbones, he knew she'd heard him. They crossed the open expanse in easy silence and skirted a high school football field before cresting a small rise and seeing the sprawling grounds of the Essex Memorial Hospital spread before them. Oh, wow, Mackenzie said, stopping and leaning in against his side. The grounds looked like an airport parking lot, with vehicles covering every spare inch. Stationary cars were clogging the road into the hospital and spilled back out onto the main road. People were abandoning their cars and heading on foot toward the ER, even though a white bedsheet hung across the entrance with the words, "We can't help, go home," spray-painted on it. There was a growing crowd in front of the closed doors, and it didn't appear they were letting anyone enter. Why aren't they helping? Jake asked in frustration. Maybe they can't do anything. If there was a cure for this thing, then they'd be handing it out. And maybe the hospital staff is sick too. If everyone in there is contagious, they're going to want to quarantine themselves. Everyone should quarantine. Otherwise, it's just going to keep spreading, he agreed. All these people. Mackenzie squeezed her eyes shut. I don't want to see them. I don't want them to be sick. I don't want to get sick. We are not getting sick, Mac. We're going to be fine. We just have to steer clear of contact with anyone and get back to Sanford. Mackenzie seemed to have shrunk into herself, and she couldn't tear her eyes from the scene before them. He refused to let anything, even reality, stop them from getting home. Holding her elbow, Jake marched them away and across to the main road, dodging a woman assisting an elderly man who was coughing blood into his hands. He couldn't take much more of watching Mackenzie limp along. It was killing him to see her in pain. The road ahead was crammed with empty vehicles, and he made his decision. We're going to take one of these cars. If this virus is airborne, then these vehicles have probably just had infected people in them. We can't risk it, Mackenzie said. He spun her toward him, forcing her to stop. Enough! I know you're trying to suck it up, but your feet are really hurting. I can't keep walking past vehicles, watching you suffer. Remember I told you about the West Northern case? They knew nothing about this virus, how it's carried, how long people are contagious for. We have to be careful. Her eyes were wet with unshed tears. Pulling her against his chest, Jake propped his chin on the top of her head, knowing he'd do anything for her. Anything except risk her life. You're right. That row of houses down the block have vehicles in their driveways. We'll take one of them. Someone carrying the virus could have been driving them, but at least they're not parked on their way to the hospital. We're just going to take someone's car? She snuffled into the front of his shirt. It's a shitty thing to do, but yeah, normal rules don't apply at the moment, and we need to do anything we can to get home safely. Mac nodded and pulled back. Okay, but maybe we should talk to some of these people to see what they know about the virus. All they know is that they have it, and I don't want us to be anywhere near them. But we could find out how long they've had it for, what their symptoms are, if they know anyone. She paused. Anyone who's died. I think we can assume that yesterday is when most symptoms became obvious, although who knows how long the virus was incubating. And the news reports I heard said they were flu-like symptoms, but that must have been before it progressed to the bleeding. I don't think they're sick for long before it kills them, Mackenzie said quietly, and he followed the direction of her eyes. A young woman with a mop of curly auburn hair was sitting in a stationary car, her head tilted at an odd angle, and the lower half of her face coated with blood. She wasn't moving. In silent agreement, Jake and Mackenzie started moving again, crossing the road to avoid walking next to the line of parked vehicles. Jake was conscious of a lack of sound. It seemed the entire town was muted. There was no noise of traffic, and even the mob of people at the front of the hospital were milling quietly or slumped listlessly against the walls. A dog barked once, off in the distance, but there wasn't even a breeze to disturb the fall-colored trees around them. So they both startled badly when they stepped off the sidewalk onto a front lawn, and a gravelly voice greeted them. "You two looking for transport?" A grizzled man was sitting on his front porch, salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed and a shotgun resting on his lap. Instinctively, Jake moved in front of Mackenzie. "We're not looking for any trouble. We just want to get home." "You're not sick, are you?" It was more an observation than a question. "No, sir." "Well, you can't take my truck, but my neighbor fell over dead yesterday. He wasn't sick for more than half a day, so you can take his truck because he sure as shit won't be needing it." He spat on the ground at his feet. "By my reckoning, there's going to be a lot of shit no one's going to be needing," he said, tipping his chin in the hospital's direction. "Has your neighbor been in his truck recently?" asked Mackenzie, stepping out from behind Jake. "Just in case, his germs are in it." The old man chuckled. "Nah, he only left the house on a Sunday afternoon to visit the bar, and then again on Monday to get his groceries. He hasn't been in it for a couple of days." "So you're okay if we just take it?" Jake flicked his eyes between the shotgun and the faded Ford F-Series in the next driveway over. "Sure, son, take it. The keys will be behind the visor." He nodded. "And you take care of that little missy of yours, you hear?" "That's the plan, sir."